just so we have it going. We are small, but let's try to be mighty. So not having grown up here, so I am a newbie for those of you who don't know me, for Ron, basically. I'm a newbie here. So you have to fill me in on what it was like to live in Marblehead or work in Marblehead in the 80s, you know, the restaurants, what you did for fun, the businesses, that type of thing. So we're open to anybody's comments, or if you have questions of each other, certainly. Susan, were you here in the 80s still?
Not really. I was in the early 80s, I was in Boston and Cambridge, but I would come up here a lot for weekends. And I'll be glad to tell you a little bit about my recollections, but I'm sorry I missed hearing what you all were saying about Lynn, because one of the great hopes of my life is to live long enough to see Lynn come back. What were you all saying, that the family moved to Marblehead because they couldn't afford to live in Lynn back there? I thought that was fascinating.
Why don't you go ahead, Ron, and explain it?
If you don't mind.
I was just mentioning that I grew up in Lynn and went to, in fact, I'm right in the middle of organizing the 65th reunion of the class of 1956 at Lynn English High School.
Wow.
But Lynn was a booming place in the early 90s. In fact, starting in 1860, it was a very big place for industry and actually the women's rights movement, the labor movement began really in Lynn. By about 1900, it was the shoe capital of the world. Shortly thereafter, there's a great story about the forming of General Electric, Thomas Edison, and I forget what Charles's last name is, but you had General Electric in Lynn. And so by the 20s, 30s, and 40s, Lynn was a booming place. So when I was, 5, 10 years old, I went to my grandfather's shoe factory where he was a manager. And on Saturday morning, and we'd go downtown in Lynn and walk around, and it was just absolutely crowded. Just a booming place. So, and then one of the areas was the Diamond District, where all the wealthy shoe manufacturers lived, which is Ocean Street in Lynn, right along the water. And then things began to happen. The shoe industry moved south. Moved south and around the world, and the GE moved out, and Lynn began to just disintegrate, along with nepotism, narrow thinking, and probably corruption. And Lynn just fell into really hard times starting in the 60s, 70s, 80s.
But it played a big part in Marblehead life, because I remember the beautiful old Victorian buildings, and it was almost a more, well, it was our urban place to go shopping. I remember the store, the clothes shops, and the Edison Hotel restaurant, and the Hawthorne. Growing up in the 50s and 60s, it still played a part in Marblehead life, which is why I was interested to hear about what you were saying about it.
Yeah, in the end, I mentioned that that David Guide once told me that that his parents originally moved to Marblehead because they couldn't afford a home in Lynn.
Oh, that's great.
So Ron,
I think that's right about when you jumped in, Susan.
yeah. Ron, when you were growing up in Lynn, or from what you remember, because you were quite young, it sounds like, how did the people living in Lynn view Marblehead? Do you know?
That's interesting, because I think of myself as the epitome of provincialism. I have to say that from the time my youth, including going into college, I had been to Marblehead twice. Physically in Marblehead twice. I didn't know what it was. I had no idea what it was. And my best friend's father took us fishing in Marblehead Harbor. The first time I ever was in a house in Marblehead or any institution was when I went to Tom's parents' house here on Seven Oar Road when I was in college, and he was my roommate. So I don't know that my narrowness is quite common, but that's who I was. I remember going on almost like an overnight trip to a place called Richardson's in Middleton. So, but Lynn was the heart of I think there was a place called Salem that people used to go to, but we didn't know about that. We spent our time in the summers on Fisherman's Beach, and people would come from strange places like Peabody and Salem and come down to Swampscott to Fisherman's Beach. But Lynn was the place, was central, and you're right, Susan. Was your family part of the moving companies, Susan? The Lipsky?
No, that my maiden name was Miller. That's my husband's name, and he's from Iowa. So, but I remember them well. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Bill Connolly.
And who was the Tom on Seven Oar Road you mentioned?
Who is what?
Tom on. You said you came to Marblehead just to visit your friend Tom.
I was saying before that I was very fortunate being this narrow-minded, unsophisticated person from Lynn, that I had two roommates from Marblehead, and when I was in college, so I got to know and to learn a little bit about Marblehead.
Oh, I know. I was just wondering who they were.
Oh, one was Tom Semillian, and the Semillian family was pretty well known for a variety of reasons, especially owning Mass Camera.
Well, they're still here.
And then but the other one was Bill Keene, and Bill was we would kid him and respect him because he was a descendant of John Alden and Priscilla Mellon, and he was named after Elbridge Gerry. So, we would be impressed that we had such a native among us. So,
Isn't it crazy that it's crazy that the 80s was over 40 years ago.
Mm.
Like crazy. I went from ninth grade on. In 1980 I was in ninth grade, so the end of the Great Race, and sort of the cusp of the cusp of, I remember the first sort of Nintendo Game Boys, the Sony earphones, it was the beginning of, I don't know, a much more casual life, probably. A few thoughts.
Was it your grandfathers that had the store, Jack, the grocery store? Did they still have?
Yeah. And the grocery store at Osborne's, the grocery store part of it ended up closing in the late 80s, and then it lasted until probably the mid 90s, until they closed the liquor store. But a lot of changes in Marblehead during the 80s. Bill Conley was a selectman for most of the 80s, wasn't he?
Oh, you're muted. Sorry. Hold on.
You're on mute, Willie.
Down bottom left, Bill. Now, on the bottom left, there it is.
Does that help?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Here you go.
The jury's still out on that, whether that was the right move, Willie.
Greenie's in the other room, so she's in full control of this. So
What happened in the 80s, Bill?
I have no idea, right?
What'd you have for breakfast?
Is it breakfast time? You know, I'm here to listen and learn.
Yeah.
And if I hear any comments, maybe I can go on to that. But yes, I was involved in the selectmen for a while and had a wonderful time in the 80s. And actually, I had an office in downtown Lynn. Not only that, I had two offices. At the corner of Market Street and Monroe Street, the Travelers Insurance Company, I worked for them. I moved an office out of Boston to there. And the claims office was upstairs. And then from there, I went to work for an insurance agency in the bank building there on, gosh, I don't know.
security, the security trust.
It was in the Popular Bank, but we were on the third floor, Thomas B. Knight Insurance. And I was there for 17 years.
Hmm.
And then I opened up my own shop after that. But Lynn was an exciting place to be. And I was around there during the changes of Lynn, which Lynn was a magnificent city. And I was really sad to see what was happening there, but it happened and they lost a lot of industry and it kept going downhill from there. And hopefully there's a little revival now in Lynn historically over on the other side of Monroe Street, around where the new bus terminal is, et cetera.
Lynn
I'll
was
leave it
so,
at that.
Lynn was so important to Marblehead. It seems like growing up, all of my friends' fathers worked at GE or did something in Lynn. People were not commuting to Boston or Lynn was like the big city for Marblehead. I didn't live here in the 80s. I'm older than Jack. So I was in grad school and then working, but I had a lot of connections and I kept coming back. I was living in Boston and Cambridge and I'd come up weekends, especially in the summer. And later I moved to Washington and I'd come up with my husband occasionally for a weekend. We'd stay at like one of the yacht clubs or a B&B. And that's when I noticed that B&Bs were flourishing. There were still some of the classic restaurants and shops in my childhood, but I think a lot was happening in Marblehead in the 80s, I think because of the demographics of the town. Growing up, I counted, I had 22 relatives within a 5-minute walk of my house. I don't know if you all had the same thing, close relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins. And by the 80s, everyone had moved away. But when my mother turned 75, we rented a house back here for a big party and relatives came from all over. And that's really one of the big changes I noticed in the 80s. There were a lot of Marblehead houses were then rentals or had gone back to being summer rentals. B&Bs started. A lot more houses were broken up into apartments. And I think that's because in the 70s, a lot of new businesses sprouted up in Boston. You know, Northeast Airlines was headquartered here, that later became Delta. And when we moved back and bought a house here in 2002, every other person we ran into, it seemed like, would say to us, "Oh, you live in that house. I dated someone who used to live in that house." And we thought, how is that possible? Until we realized that the house had been broken up into apartments in the 70s and 80s. And it was full of Northeast and then Delta Airlines stewardesses and pilots. And so it just seemed like a lot more people were moving here that were commuting into Boston, which I don't remember going on much when I was growing up. I don't know if you have different memories of it, but it just seemed like the 80s was a big change from kind of traditional living in Marblehead to a lot more job mobility and at least that's my impression.
I remember Salem being a local hub as well, and I think Salem has had the benefit of a little bit better luck of a revitalization, probably just because of the proximity to the waterfront, versus Salem to Lynn.
Yeah.
Was the train wasn't still here in the 80s, was it?
No.
No, not to Marblehead, 62 or so, I think.
60s.
So you're driving into Boston, or people are driving into Boston
Yes.
for work.
That was a big development. Let's see, we had the bridge. When was the tunnel built? The Sumner Tunnel.
That was the early 1900s.
It
Thing.
was.
Yeah.
Because the bridge was the Mystic Bridge, now the Tobin Bridge, was built in the 40s. As I remember, it divided and destroyed another city, which was Chelsea, the closest in city to Boston, which you think would have had an incredible boom economically. But once they put the bridge in, it kind of cut up the whole city, and that's around when Chelsea started declining. But anyway, I commuted to school in Chestnut Hill from Marblehead in the 60s. And the traffic was bad, but nothing like it is now, obviously.
That would be an impossible commute now.
That would be
Couldn't do that. It was horrible commute, like over an hour. So it sounds like we're getting to a point in town where is there a movement from a lot of single family houses of people who have lived here for generations? Is that when we start to see? Is it the 80s when we start to see some newer faces coming in, breaking houses into apartments and eventually condos? Did you all notice that as well?
That was my memory of it. But.
Yeah.
That was sort of mid to late 80s when the conversion boom started happening. I often tell people, at least from my own recollection, it was up until about 1980 that Marblehead was more of a blue collar town than not. And then things started to really change in the 80s. And I think that had a lot to do with the appreciation for the geographic location. I mean, there was the 70s leading up to the 80s, Ted Hood was in his heyday. Just again, a freer life where, 70s and 80s, Natty's was hopping and the great race was going on, and life seemed to sort of blossom out of the more strict confines of the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, where what those people remember a lot of and what they lived by was sort of the shadows of the Great Depression and stuff like that. So like 70s and 80s, and there started to be a huge shift in demographic and how people enjoyed life and stuff like that. So I mean, I was a bartender at the Landing in the mid 80s, 86 I think it was, for a few years. And, you know, from Wednesday night to Sunday night, the bar was 4 deep and everybody was just out enjoying the excesses of the 80s. And it seems like we have the excesses of every generation, but
But that was people, a lot of people from Boston by then.
yeah,
That was the
Yeah.
point I was making, and I agree, the 50s, 60s, and 70s were kind of the shadow still of World War II, and the economy wasn't that great. The 70s was a huge recession, but in the 80s, the whole national economy took off, and I think that really changed I think that's when the character of Marblehead changed from kind of local to people moving in from all over, and that was my sense too.
yeah, I would agree.
Big change.
Do you find it,
People were more affluent. You know, that's when you had more development and renovating and all that kind of came into being. People actually painted their houses. I mean,
When, Jack, when was that development done on the harbor? It seemed to me that that was like the first thing I recall. Was that the 70s or the 80s? You know which ones I mean? What, you know what I'm talking about?
Glover Landing?
What's it called?
Glover Landing?
Yeah, I think it's Glover Landing. When was that? Who was the developer that did
That was 50s.
Was
No,
that
it was in
the 50s?
they tore the Rockmere down in the 60s, and so Glover Landing was built in the late 60s.
Okay.
Late 60s. Yeah, I mean, that seemed to me the first time I began to hear about, you know, conversion developments, et cetera.
Well, that piece of land was on the warrant for the town to buy for public property.
Yeah.
And the town, I was in a meeting at the high school, and I was in amongst a lot of Marblehead people, and a lot of all those people voted not to buy the land, and I voted to buy the land, and it went down, I think, by 3 votes, believe it or not,
Mm,
of the town owning that piece of property.
wow.
The Rockmere owners wanted to give it to the town for a public park. What a shame.
No. The
I mean, sell it.
owner was out of there, or he was on his last legs, meaning financially. So he wanted to get rid of the land, and the town went out there to buy it. And of course, I don't have to tell any more about it. But the anchor's still there. So, and I'll give you a trivia. Well, I won't give you a trivia, but the next meeting, you can tell me how much that anchor weighs and when it was put there. It's available.
But by the way, just to let you know of what you're saying, Susan, I live in the Stackpole house. Right? I live in the Stackpole house.
Oh, okay.
Right. The owners of the appliance store in
Yep.
downtown Lynn. So, you know, that's just the idea of, you know, of the history of some of the building. The other thing that's interesting is that when I have spare time, which is a lot of time, I go down to the Panama fruit feeder and watch the birds. And so I keep thinking that whatever Leo is doing, it reminds me of my Panama fruit feeder, but I haven't seen any birds on that Leo's picture there.
some meetings are more active than others bird-wise. It's always fun.
By the way, Lauren, one of the reasons, and it may not be appropriate in the 80s discussion, but if there was a little time near the end, I really wanted to talk about the 70s and some of the things that we did in town and the connection of the town in the 1970s with the 1770s and the committees of correspondence, all because of the talk that's coming up on the long 1774, the long year of revolution.
Yeah.
And so it may not be appropriate for this discussion, but if it is, I wanted to spend a few minutes on that. If not, maybe you and I could do it separately, that's all.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see where we go. It's let's see, it's 10:30 now. So I was gonna ask a question, but I can't remember what it was now. Hold on a second. Oh, I was gonna ask if the change in the demographics that you're all speaking to, did it change the type of businesses that were in town? Like, is that why your grandfather's store went out of business, Jack? Or is it something to do with that shift?
No, I mean, this was a more of a generational shift within the family. That the family was, there were 3 brothers and 2 sisters from my great grandfather, and they were all just sort of getting older and then going their separate ways. So that was the shift in that regard. But there was still a lot of commerce sort of centralized in Marblehead. I often talk about sort of the transition to people heading out to the malls and stuff like that, but there was still enough of a root in Marblehead that one of my uncles opened up Osborne Greenhouse, which used to be Smith's Greenhouse, and stayed in the family business. And Marblehead was still very much tight knit. There was still a call fire department in the beginning of the 80s. And there was still the sense that Marblehead was a little bit safer than other places, because if you weren't being watched, you likely weren't being watched by your parents, but there were other eyes always on you. And it was almost as if you were more afraid to get caught by somebody else's parent than one of your own.
What did you call the fire department? A what fire department?
There were call firemen in the 80s up until I think it was about 1980, 83 or 84 when the chiefs shifted from Ed Creighton to Charlie Murray.
Does that
So-
mean that? What
So
does that
there
mean?
there were volunteers.
Oh, okay, okay.
It was a hired force, but when a big fire would come in, they'd reach out to the callman, as Willie can certainly attest to.
Were you a call-in, Bill?
I was, and so was Jack's father.
Oh,
There was approximately 7 or 8 callmen, Tinker Carroll, Flynn, and
Cashy?
Boothie, and we used to go when we had tappers in our houses, and we'd go to the fires, and we would supplement the force that was on there, which but it all came to an end when the union showed up, because they didn't want any part of volunteers. So, however, you hinted back a ways about the population shifts in that. I'll tell you a short selectman story. I can't remember whether it was in the 70s or the 80s. Marilyn Reese was on the board, a very popular member. And all of a sudden, the MBTA said no more bus service to Salem. Well, Marilyn took a fit. And she says, "What do you mean? You don't know what you're talking about." Well, Marilyn volunteered herself, and she went down to the bus stop where Starbucks is now. And she monitored the buses going to Salem. And of course, the MTA said there was no ridership. And Marilyn monitored that for a good month, if not 2 or maybe more. And she finally found out, yes, there was no ridership going to Salem. Well, if you want to go today down to that same bus stop, you see 2 series of buses coming into town, 441 and 442. There is absolutely no ridership on those buses to sustain the expense of what they're doing. And I'm surprised they haven't eliminated at least one route of that today, because the people used to come in from Lynn, from all over. And of course, these buses go to Lynn now on their way to Boston or wherever. But I think I've taken enough time, but just to be alerted to the fact that the ridership is we had a coffee group in Starbucks, and we used to count the people on the buses, believe it or not, nothing else to do. And
I would like,
I'd
like to,
it's sad. So that's enough.
no, I would like to chime in here because the buses are a continuing theme in Marblehead. When we moved back in 2002, we lived on the corner, the house I mentioned that all the stewardesses and pilots had lived in at various times. We were in that house across from the Harbor Light Inn that's up on the cliff on the corner of Washington Street, Pearl Street, and Mechanic Street.
Mhm.
I don't know if you remember when you were young, but it's the cliff that all the kids used to sit on for the parades and stuff. Anyway, I painted the house had been red. I painted it white, which is how I remembered it from my youth. And the next thing I knew, it was like covered in soot and black. And I could look out my window, and literally inches from my window, I'd see buses because the house is right on the street, almost no sidewalk. So I did a study that summer and I counted. There were 55 buses, this is in 2002, that would come into Marblehead and go out of Marblehead. So 110 buses were passing my house a day. I spent the whole summer writing up a study about it. The fumes were horrendous. When I looked into it, Marblehead had, I mean, it's a whole health thing, but it had higher incidences of various cancers. And anyway, I fought to have the MBTA cut back the buses coming into town. There were at least 4, if not 5 different routes then. And what they said was, Marblehead was the turning around point. All the buses would go to the fire station on, was it Franklin Street?
Franklin.
And use the restroom there. And that's where the buses would wait before turning around. All the buses that went through Central Square and Lynn to Wonderland and Haymarket Square. We no longer have buses that go to Boston from Marblehead. They cut out the Haymarket route. They only go as far as Wonderland. But, and I found the same thing. They were always empty. And I wrote up this study and sent a letter saying, well, can you have them turn around at the high school or someplace so they're not coming downtown, because they were really hurting the antique buildings. That was the time when cities all over the world, like Florence and Rome and Paris, had eliminated buses from the central cities because they were hurting the antique buildings, and those were stone buildings. So you can imagine what they were doing to the old building, the wooden clapboard buildings in Marblehead. Well, anyway, the MBTA refused to cut back the bus service because they needed to use the restroom at the I mean, I have the letters, Lauren, this is actual historic stuff. The restroom at the fire station. And literally no one was ever on the buses. Well, so I did a petition. I went all over the town by myself. I went to all the restaurants. And Pete, I forgot, I can't remember his last name, but he had a restaurant right on Washington Street. Do you all remember him?
Pete Marmino.
Thank you. He started, this is what, living in a small town. He started a movement against me. He called me the outside. He had no idea about my background or that I lived here since 1950 and whatever. The outsiders are trying to stop our buses. And he got everyone in the town to turn against me. I mean, I'm not kidding, 110 buses passed my house. And anyway, so I just gave up. But
You know what?
eventually finances are what killed cut back the buses. So if you think we have a lot of buses, the empty buses now, and I wouldn't fight it, because there are people who are using them who are working in town.
Yeah, agreed.
But what's interesting about that,
Landscapers and maids and people coming from Lynn. So I'm not sure I'd fight it now. You don't want to start another war battle.
that what's interesting about that is that if you notice, there's a proposal going through the town now about having a bus for
Minibus.
students, okay? Which is interesting. I say Bill, I hear Willie, but I still think of Bill as Bill Connolly. Bill, just about a week ago, I wrote a note to Chris Stevens because I thought sorry about going back into the 70s, but in 1976, I think it was Marilyn, who is part of our Bicentennial Committee of Correspondence, who proposed a bus system for Marblehead. And interestingly enough, I have the material in front of me where town meeting approved a bus system, $15,000 to have a bus system. And I think it was all Marilyn. I think Marilyn Reese was the proponent of it. It passed town meeting. There was a bus system in 1976 that went on from, I think, October until June. And not surprisingly, there was a dearth in the amount of people that used that bus system. And I think at the end of that pilot project year, it was disbanded because I think whoever was maybe there to provide, I don't know if it was a selectman or whoever, did not provide any more funds, and that bus system died.
Are you talking about school buses?
No, this was just so that people could get from maybe Atlantic Ave to West Shore Drive or whatever, but it was truly a in-town bus system that ran from 76 to 77.
Was it because of the bicentennial, do you think?
Well, we had, that's what I was going to talk about at some point.
Go ahead.
Carl King and I formed a bicentennial committee of correspondence based on what had happened in 1772, 1773. Sam Adams had proposed that there be committees of correspondence, sent out a letter to the different towns in Massachusetts to talk about the abuses of the king and of England and to deal with injustices. And so the first town that responded and formed a committee of correspondence was the town of Marblehead, with such names as Azer Orne, Elbridge Gary, Joshua Orne, Thomas Gary, Captain John Glover, and Deacon William Dolliver were the committee of correspondence. So we formed such a committee in Marblehead. And what we did was try to figure out what things, I mean, this is 1974. And if you think about government abuses and you think about Nixon being president, you can understand the incentive for doing that. But one of the things that came out of it was, I think, Maryland. Again, Bill, you may be able to correct me, but I'm trying to remember who the person was that came out of our committee and came up with this project. And I'm pretty sure that it was Marilyn Reese, which is very consistent with what you're talking about. And it was a great idea, I think.
When did the school buses stop? I mean, growing up in the winter, no parent ever drove us to school. We took buses.
We used to
Like
walk.
well, we'd walk, but when the village school opened, I remember it was quite a distance from my house, and we had school buses. And one of the first things I noticed when I moved back was the lines of cars of mothers picking up, I shouldn't be sexist, mothers, parents picking up their kids. You know, for years here before COVID, before the pandemic, you couldn't drive in Marblehead at 2 PM. I mean, you couldn't get from point A to point B because of the traffic of people picking up their kids at school. So does anybody remember why or when they stopped the school buses, which I think were a lot more, if you're going to talk about the environment, probably now they could reinstitute school buses that are, what is it, hydrogen or whatever, that would be a lot better than having hundreds of cars out every day driving kids to school.
No, because there's no, because there are no schools north of, no elementary schools north of Bell School anymore. They're now looking at busing again in Marblehead. So that's something that they're looking at, and it's according to state rules. But I don't know. I always lived close enough to walk, and I was still late to school. So, but I remember, you know, the bus used to go over to. There was a bus that went to Salem, as well as out 1A and to, you know, 129 towards Lynn in Boston. But I don't know. I don't remember when the school bus system was.
Well, Ron, getting back to your comments, I'm drawing a blank, but if something says that it could have possibly been Maryland. And I think that bus company was the beginning of the Salem trolley, was it not? That we hired to go around town for a while. And after that, it just petered out because, again, it was a new thing is always full, like a restaurant, and then the patronage falls off. But the original bus service in Marblehead was owned by Gibby Pauley, and he was a prisoner in World War II. His brother got killed in action, and he came back to Marblehead, started Pauley Real Estate, which is on the corner of Essex Street. And he started a bus service to the Neck. And I have a picture of a gas station with his bus in it way back, Cashies. But he started that he did two things. He took the kids from the Neck to the schools, and he also had a regular ride around. Of course, that didn't last long. I mean, he couldn't afford to keep that. But that was originally, that was back in the late 40s. So, however, then you come into your situation. Now, regarding the buses prior to this bus, the students used to be able to go on the so-called Eastern Mass bus for nothing. If they were in Clifton, they would take a bus to the high school, which was on Pleasant Street, and the kids from downtown could come up, and they wouldn't charge them. They'd just let them ride the bus to go to school.
Yeah.
And that's my recollection.
Yeah.
That was before my time.
Yeah.
I'm sorry there aren't more women on this who would remember some of the shops, because there was a little transit. As I said, I wasn't living here full time. But there was transition of, I know, some of the shops downtown. Do any of you, we still had, let's see.
Oh, Kniff's was down there.
Yeah.
Who was next to Miss Bell's shop was down there. The Atlantic Restaurant. I don't know if Bruce Hamlin's was still around. I think Begonia
No, I think it was gone.
probably bought the building by then, but Shubes was still there. Rusty's Breakfast Shop was where the Fresca Pizza is now.
Molly Waldo.
No, the Molly Walder was probably the 76 in the 80s. It was the 70s. Yeah, it was, because when ninth grade, I washed dishes. So that would have been 1980. Then it was the 76.
You mentioned working at the Landing. I worked there for 1 month this summer of 1972 when it opened. I was a waitress there.
Reggie Hartley's store was there on School Street.
Bill Prescott's store.
Yeah. And then I'm pretty sure Bud Oren had his hockey shop. Probably.
Oh, those are all the boy stores. I was trying to remember what the
I
girls-
gave you Miss Bell's shop.
Yeah.
There was it was definitely the 80s when Alpine Ski and Sport was around, and then Good Sports. I think it was Kip Bruins or Mark Bruins who had the recycled sports shop, which was a huge hit in Marblehead. What other stores were around?
Restaurants. I keep coming back to it because I'm kind of obsessed with it, but do you all, the General Glover House at Vinance, Square still existed in the 80s.
It
I don't
still
know.
exists now.
Yeah, except not as a restaurant. I mean,
Scary.
I guess I'm fixated with their popovers. I've never forgotten. That was the big treat, was going there for popovers. Yeah.
But yeah,
I think
Benetton in Marblehead.
Oh, Benetton, really?
Yeah,
Benetton, there was Talbot. Well, that was much later. Benetton.
it was
think-
down where the next to the muffin shop, that building.
Oh, wow. I only ever saw that in a mall somewhere.
I know.
Interesting.
Well,
Where was Mary Mecco? The Marblehead, what was it called?
Prince,
Handprints. Yeah.
Marblehead,
handprints.
Marblehead
Handprint.
handprint, right. Sue McDonald's place.
Yeah, Kathy.
Oh,
Kathy
was-
McDonald.
Rooks. You mentioned Susan. That reminded me. Susan Rooks. There was a woman's shop called, or something called Rooks.
King's Rook.
No. This was
Rooks was in Lynn. Rooks was in downtown Lynn.
there was. I can't remember the ladies' shops in Marblehead. There were a bunch of them.
Handprints was
Zonagedel was there for years, but they disappeared early.
who was it?
Zonagedel, not Zonagedel. Oh, I'm sorry. But they had a place in West Palm Beach in the wintertime, and they had a store right where the Atlantic restaurant was in the summertime,
Where was the Atlantic restaurant?
where the Chinese restaurant is today.
Unpleasant?
Yeah, Atlantic,
Atlantic.
Sorry, the Atlantic. Yeah, that makes more sense.
across from CVS.
I got you. Thank you.
Of course, I won't get into the gas stations.
Well, no, you should though. There still were a bunch, right? At that point.
Don't forget, there were 7 gas stations between Five Corners
Yeah.
and Central Street. 5 working gas stations.
There were
all at the same-
13
all at the
total
same
when I
time.
was growing up. 13 when I was growing up.
Well, if you watch Grown Ups with Adam Sandler, you saw the revival of one of the gas stations.
Yeah, I just was looking at there's a little guide to Marblehead. It's about that big and doesn't have a date on it. It's trying to date it. It's like early 20th century. And the number of car dealerships, gas stations, and repair stations is astounding. It's amazing.
I wrote that. If that's what you're referring to.
No, it's a little tiny, it's early 20th century guidebook.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't write that one.
But I have what you wrote in the archive. Absolutely. It's
There
great.
was a total, not all at one time, of 22 to 23 gas stations that would serve the public, not the ones that would have gas for their own customers or their
Oh.
businesses.
Remarkable.
Was it something that happened in town government that forced them all out, or did they just disappear on their own?
Not at all. Not at all. They just went by the side.
But wait a minute, I have a story about that too. I was talking before he closed to Phil, was it? The last guy,
Yeah.
Phil, yeah, and who was on Atlantic Avenue.
Right.
And he told me he had to close because at that point, you couldn't make, the gas prices were low, which they weren't in the 70s and 80s. But at that point, he said you couldn't make any money from the gas. You had to have one of the little convenience stores as part of your gas station. That's where gas station owners made their money. And this is when I asked him why he was closing the last station of Marblehead. And he said the town of Marblehead did not want a convenience store, which I always thought was strange because not long after that or around that time, we got the 7-Eleven that's down by the Starbucks. But he gave that as the reason for why he had to close, because they thought convenience stores would be tacky or not in keeping with Marblehead or something. You can ask.
I don't think that message came from the town. A lot of those stations were not family owned. They were owned by a corporation. And the corporations were really putting, pardon the expression, the screws to them.
Yeah.
And yes, Phil had to close because he wouldn't open a convenience store type situation.
He
that's
told me he
correct.
wanted to, and the town would not let him.
No, I had a little bit to do with the town at that time, and I don't recall any pressure put on any of those stations to have a convenience store. But anyhow,
No, the pressure to have it was put on by the
oh yeah,
oil company.
correct.
Well, it's just about 11 o'clock, and so I want to give people the opportunity to go if they want to. But Ron, if you're willing to stay and share what you had about the 70s, I'd love to keep going. And anybody who wants to say, you're welcome to, I assume. And then if you want to go, you're welcome to do that too. So
That's great.
take it away.
Yeah. As I was saying, around in 1772, Sam Adams and the Committee of Correspondence created something called the Boston Pamphlet. And within it was a letter of correspondence. And they were talking about the injustices and the issues that were going on with England and everything that we sort of know about from the 1700s that were happening. And so what they did was they created this Boston Pamphlet, which outlined the injustices, and sent that to the towns in Marblehead and all around Massachusetts. And so within about a week, Marblehead met, I think the selectmen met, and they responded by appointing a committee. And that was what I was mentioning. The committee, they called it a committee of grievances. And it was Azor Orne, Elbridge Gerry, Joshua Orne, Thomas Gerry, Captain John Glover, and Deacon William Dolliver. And so, as I said, that Marblehead in December of 1772 was the first town to respond to the Boston Committee of Correspondence and Committee of Grievances. And of course, that's why I was thinking primarily, Lauren, it got me to think when I saw what was the long year of revolution, and just wondering whether as part of that conversation, there might be some reference to the fact that in 1774, what was happening in Marblehead was revolutionary, and that we were, to my way of thinking, one of the causes of the revolution was Sam Adams's committees of correspondence, joined in by Marblehead. And then I think the second one to join in was Ipswich. So, you know, that was part of it. And if you needed or you wanted for the records, what I have is I actually have the original notes and minutes from the town of the activities that the Committee of Correspondence did throughout the late, mid, early 70s to 1776. So what we did was in 1974, we, as part of the bicentennial, asked, gee, I don't know, were you on at that time, Bill? We asked the Board of Selectmen to hold a special meeting to talk about these issues. Again, this is the time of Nixon and then Ford, to talk about the injustices. And although we didn't get a favorable ruling from the selectmen about holding a special meeting to talk about reinstituting the committees of correspondence, we did have on March of 1974, Article 49 was moved and seconded that in order that every member of this community qualified to vote in town affairs have a proper sense of the grievances which led to the founding of this republic, the letter of correspondence from the town of Boston dated November 20, 1772, and contained in the Boston Pamphlet, a copy of which was by vote of the December 15, 1772 town meeting, lodged in the town clerk's office, be read at this town meeting and at the opening of each and every town meeting hereafter until July 4, 1976. And I indeed had the privilege in 74, 75, and 76 of opening the town meeting by reading segments of the Boston Pamphlet. And in spite of Steve Howe telling me to read quickly, I read slowly so that it could be heard. But again, this is all, you know, the part that Marblehead had and in the Revolution, and the part about the town being involved in the Boston Pamphlet and Sam Adams and the Committee of Correspondence, I thought was important when you're thinking about this meeting that's coming up in, whether you do it or not, it just keyed into me when I read that they were going to talk about 1774. And I wanted to make sure that we all knew that Marblehead had a very prominent role in furthering the cause of the revolution.
That's fabulous. Yeah, so the talk, which is not this upcoming Thursday, but the following Thursday by Professor Mary Beth Norton, who's fabulous. Her book, so her book does touch on it, and we're hoping that she's going to, you know, bring Marblehead into this, maybe more than she would when she talks in other places. That's the goal, at least. So we'll see what happens. But with the 250th of the Revolutionary War coming up, I would definitely love to talk to you more about, you know, working with us and with all the other places in town. We're just starting to kind of get rolling with that. I've been talking to Chris Johnson over at the Historical Commission, and I'm hoping that in the next couple of weeks, maybe a month, when people start to come back from Florida and Arizona and all the places that some of them have gone to, we could maybe have a big meeting that anybody's invited to and start to talk about how we're going to commemorate the 250th, because it's already kind of started, really, if you think about, you know, how far before 1775 things start to happen that really escalate into the war. Yeah. But certainly by 2025 we need to have completely kicked into gear, so we got to start talking about it soon.
And then in 2029, we've got if some of us live that long, we've got the 400th anniversary of Marblehead.
Yes, indeed. So that's another committee altogether. So we have a lot of stuff on our plates, I think, moving forward, a lot of interesting commemorations.
Yeah. Lauren, do we know, do we have on the website, do we have your email address? Because what I'll do is I'll send you something and you can,
Great.
that'll give you my email address. But
Yes,
what's yours?
please do. I can put it in the chat too, if that's helpful. But it is on our website. So if you go to marbleheadmuseum.org, go to the About section, there's a list of staff and my email is linked there.
Ron,
my-
that was good memories. And having, that was a long time ago. I was elected in 1973.
Really? Okay. Yeah.
So I was there listening to you
Yeah.
with old Steve Howe trying to run the show.
Yeah.
However, I can remember you doing that. And I thought it was great. It was a great, because it led right up to the 1976 celebration. So you did a good job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you guys. I'm so glad you all joined today. We got to talk about the 80s and the 70s. So there you go. And the 1770s. So
Right.
it was very good. So I appreciate your time and I hope you have a great weekend.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Take
Thank
care,
you.
everybody.
Enjoyed it.
Bye.
Happy Easter.